Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jay Shaw, and I'm this year's chair of the VIP Distinguished Speaker Series. The VIP Distinguished Speaker Series is one of the many programs put on by the Undergraduate Business Council for the McCombs School of Business. Today we are joined by Dean Platt, who has been on faculty for 16 years and is the new undergraduate dean of the business school. He will be interviewing Mr. Ellis Armstrong, Chief Financial Officer of Exploration and Production at BP. We will begin tonight with a Q&A between Dean Platt and Mr. Armstrong, followed by a Q&A from the audience. As a reminder, today's event will end promptly at 6:30, and we would greatly appreciate it if you could refrain from leaving early, as well as using flash photography. Mr. Armstrong has a BSc and PhD in civil engineering from Imperial College and joined BP in 1983. After several operational and commercial and planning roles, Mr. Armstrong became business unit leader for BP's Endicott operations in Alaska. In 1997, Mr. Armstrong attended the Sloan program at Stanford Business School and obtained a master's degree in business administration. He moved to Caracas in late 1997 to become president of BP Venezuela. After the merger between BP and Amoco, he returned to London to take on the role of Group Vice President Planning for the BP Group. In September 2001, Mr. Armstrong was appointed to Group Vice President Upstream for the Caribbean and Latin America, based in Buenos Aires, Argentina. In this role, he had the responsibility for the operations of BP's extensive upstream oil and gas operations in Trinidad and Tobago and Latin America. In early 2003, Mr. Armstrong returned to London as Commercial Director for BP's Exploration and Production segment. 4 years later, in November 2007, he was appointed to his current position as Chief Financial Officer for Exploration and Production. Please help me welcome Dean Platt and Mr. Armstrong.
Well, thank you, Jay. Can everyone hear me okay? Coming through all right? Good, good. Well, it's a great pleasure for me to be able to be here and to interview such an eminent guest, and thank you very much for being with us. We'll have a little bit of a dialogue here, and then there will be a chance for you all to ask questions, as Jay said a minute ago. It's a particular honor for me to interview a CFO, being from the accounting group, and he's at the pinnacle of my world, right? So that's a great honor, so thank you.
Thank you. Let me just say it's really great to be here, and I'm excited about the conversation that we've got in store. As Jay said, I'm actually studied at Imperial College, and BP has got 16 core universities around the world, and I'm really excited to be at one of the 16 here in UT. And I was just sort of reflecting in coming here. I was feeling really good about the fact that at Imperial College we've got the highest recruitment stats in Europe into the BP group, which is around 20 people. And the thing you guys should feel really good about is we recruit 3 times that number from UT. So this really is an important part of the BP group. And I think it just sort of says a lot about the quality of the educational environment here and the quality of the people who attend. I've met some of you for a few moments outside, and if the rest of you are at that same level, it's going to be a really amazing evening. So with that, I think we should start the questions.
Thank you. And I was mentioning earlier that I've been a dean, as you know, for very little time, and the very first event that I did here as dean was the orientation for the freshmen. It was sponsored by BP. So very quickly join me in giving a thank you to BP for all that they do for our school. So perhaps we could start at the beginning. You tell us a little bit about your first job.
Yeah, well, I've got 2, actually. I'm going to say a little bit about what was technically my actual first job, and then my first job with BP, if that's okay. Mm-hmm. So the first job I ever had, I was 16 years old, and it was a summer vacation job at a machine tool factory called Ectona, and it was I remember a couple of things about it. It was the first time I'd used a punch card to clock in. Mm-hmm. To go to work. It was a blue-collar environment. It was I was basically cleaning machine tools, so it was sort of dirty, filthy work. But there was a guy there called Bernard Coker who said something to me, which was like one of these sort of life lessons. And he said, "Let me tell you something about work life." And he said, "My advice to you would be, don't worry about sort of your career progression. What you've really got to focus on is doing a good job." And that was a really great piece of advice from a sort of blue-collar frontline supervisor. The first job, one of the first jobs I had with BP, and I did a degree in engineering, and this is one of the extraordinary things about our industry. I had a job as a well site petroleum engineer offshore in the North Sea in Aberdeen. And I can still remember my first experience going to an offshore oil platform in the North Sea. It was a sort of dark, stormy night. It was November. It was a big sea. I had a 2-hour helicopter flight from Aberdeen, and I can remember sort of you thinking, this is the best job in the world. I've come to work in a helicopter. I was kind of stepping off onto this oil platform in the North Sea with all of my sort of computer equipment. And it was just a sense of the excitement that you can get in the oil and gas industry. And it's something that's never left me. I still enjoy visiting our operating centers, and it's been great to have that sort of opportunity to live and work in some of the world's most amazing places.
Yeah. Well, some of those places are?
Well, North Slope of Alaska, I was just saying to the guys, I spent 4 years. I went from London, our head office in London, and I was assigned to the Endicott field on the North Slope of Alaska. And I remember quite clearly, we left London on New Year's Day, and we saw New Year several times because we had a layover in Vancouver. Then we arrived in Anchorage, Alaska. Then I had a 2-hour flight to a place called Dead Horse, landed on a gravel strip. And I drove to this place. It's literally, in Alaska, they have the license plate in Alaska says, the last frontier. And I thought, man, this really is the last frontier. And I said to the guys, when does it get light? They said, on January the 21st. So we had sort of 3 weeks where the sun didn't come up. But sort of, living and working in those type of environments, it was a great learning experience because it was my first big leadership job. And I was a young guy. I was a Brit. I was in charge of I think 150 people, and it was a really big learning experience for me to figure out how to kind of relate to that team in what was a big position of responsibility.
Yeah. Yeah. So how do you get? I'm sure these people are all very interested in knowing how you get from there to here, to being a CFO.
I've had it's interesting because my career there's like two strands to it. One was sort of operational and operations. And then I've always done, I had a role in the North Sea, which was a commercial role, basically selling capacity in a pipeline system. And I've had a twin track almost of engineering operational roles and financial commercial roles. Mm-hmm. And in the later stages of my career, I've moved more into the world of finance. Mm-hmm. And that's what I've been doing, as you say, for the last kind of several years as CFO. What's great about the experiences, though, I've obviously got a sort of a technical understanding of finance, but I've also got a deep understanding of the business. And I think the two sort of complement each other.
Yeah, you think
so when I'm making tough accounting policy decisions, I actually understand the business and technical consequences of them.
So that's something everyone should aspire to, is moving back and forth between operational
Well,
and
I think
technical?
it's good to get. I think it is good to get. You've got to go both sort of broad and deep to an extent. Mm-hmm. And I think it is important to get whatever field you're in, is sort of a breadth of understanding. And then it's important to clearly be able to operate at the level of technical depth. Yeah. And I think particularly early in your career, some people maybe go too broad too fast. Mm. And I think one of the things I would say is it's important, especially in your early years, to get good at something and have some technical depth that you can then kind of broaden out into a sort of management leadership position later on.
In whatever discipline you're in.
Yeah, I think I would say that's in the realm of a general rule. Mm-hmm. I found in BP there are some folks who they're extremely bright, they want to get on really quickly, they spread themselves, they do 6 months here, 6 months there, and then in 5 years' time, you look at what have you done? They haven't really done anything. Yeah. And I think that's a bit of a risk.
Is that one of the things that separates the people who make it up the ladder from the ones?
I think what you find is that people they've got some depth in something. Mm-hmm. I think you need some discipline depth. Mm-hmm. And then obviously as you grow, you've got to have sort of broader leadership skills, lead teams, connect with people, and those sort of skills are important. But I think particularly early on, getting a career anchor and some depth in something is important.
How do you learn things like leadership?
Well, I think there's two ways. There's obviously a component of it which can be taught in the classroom. Mm-hmm. And taught even in leadership development programs. So I believe there are sort of technical aspects to it, which are clearly important. And I've got no doubt you do sort of leadership programs here, which are important, mm-hmm. and actually can create real learning. But then I think it is important to continue that learning outside of the classroom in everyday life and everyday work. And I think you can do a lot of development in your work life. And I think there are a couple of ways I would say in particular that are important. In my own experience, we were sort of chatting in the break. I've had times where I've had a mentor who's been a leader who has mentored me in my career. And one of the great things that BP did a while ago is, in an effort to improve the gender diversity, I was put in the position of being a reverse mentor to a young black Australian woman. And I learned a lot out of that, and she learned a lot about leadership. So I think there are things in a mentoring sense that both the person who's being mentored and the person who's doing the mentoring can learn. And then we have formal 360-degree feedback processes where you get anonymous feedback from your direct reports, from your peers, which is really important, and also from your supervisor. And I think then it's a question of how open are you to that sort of feedback. And then I was saying, this is one of the questions we had just in the sort of discussion ahead of this. I think even in a setting like, if you're working on a project, or even if you're in a management meeting, you can get peer-to-peer feedback, which is, I made that intervention, it didn't work very well. I said that and I kind of, felt as though it was like a bad thing. So I think if you're open to it, you can continue to learn your whole life. But I do think, that, formal classroom training, and some of the leadership models is actually an important foundation to give you a framework to actually use developmentally when you're back at work.
Okay, good. So that's a good lead into my next question, which is, whom do you most admire?
Well, this is a good one. So I've thought about this. Given that we've got sort of the Republican convention last week and the Democratic convention, I'm staying away from political leaders.
Good.
So I've got one from the business world, and I'm a sports fan. So I've got one from the sports world as well.
Good.
So in the business world, he was my old boss, who's a guy called John Brown, who was the former chief executive of BP. And in the 90s, he was like the rock star of the oil and gas industry. He had led then the world's biggest merger, the biggest industrial merger at the time, which was BP Amoco. He led the industry consolidation to create the sort of super majors. And he was an amazing visionary leader who could and then he was kind of kicked out of BP in a very difficult circumstances over his personal life. And the thing that I admire about him today is, I don't know if this is a word, maybe it's an American word, but it's sort of his comeback ability. And he's actually recreated himself. He's now leading a major private equity firm in England, Riverstone Partners. He's actually doing a lot of work for the British government and a lot of work in the social sector. So the thing that I admire about him was his ability to, having had a very, very dramatic fall from grace as a result of kind of complications around his personal life, he's sort of recreated himself and hasn't let that sort of define his life, which I think is pretty amazing.
That's wonderful.
And the second, this is my sports story, is a guy called Dave Brailsford, who you won't know, but he's the leader of the British cycling team. And we've just gone through the London Olympics. Up until the Beijing Olympics, Great Britain had won, in the history of Olympic sport, all of it had won 1 gold medal in cycling. In Beijing, they won 8. They then changed the rules to make it more difficult for the British team to win in Great Britain. And out of 10 gold medals in track cycling, Great Britain won 7, which is pretty amazing. And this guy, David Brailsford, had a vision 10 years ago for British cycling. And the thing that I admire about him is that he's had the tenacity and the performance management to enact that vision. And there are lots of articles about him, and his big thing is that a lot of the cumulative effect of a lot of small changes can have a big impact. I think this is a big lesson for business. It's about, small changes can have a big impact. And this guy's completely detailed, he's motivational, but he's completely nuts about the details. And the 2 examples that, for me to that were pretty amazing. That he recognized that maintaining health and preventing infection was a big deal for athletes and the whole cycling team. So he got the whole team, it was like 140 people, and he had a top surgeon tell them how to wash their hands properly so they didn't kind of risk infection. And he said this is a small competitive advantage. And the other thing that it does is everywhere they travel, the team takes, every team has got a individually designed pillow to help them sleep better, and they take them with them everywhere in the world that they go. And he said, you know, it's down to, he's got this vision about, he wants to be the best cycling team. And he's got kind of, you know, the details about kind of, you know, this sort of cumulative effect of small changes kind of relating to competitive advantage, which I think is just a great story.
It is. It is. It relates to some of the things that we're seeing in healthcare in the U.S., where there's a movement toward creating lists, and it's the details on the list that you follow them properly, you get better outcomes in your healthcare. And very similar. And we'll have to start doing this in the business school too, I think, to think about our lists and our details. Maybe biking is the answer to this next question, but what is something you haven't mastered yet that you'd like to master?
Well, I think this is a great question, because I don't know if you've read it. There's a famous book by a guy called George Leonard, who studied Aikido. And the title of the book is called Mastery. And it's basically an antidote to the sort of instant gratification that we often find in today's society. And his whole point is that the journey to mastery can take many years. And you have to kind of stick with the process. And you can be on a plateau for a long time and then make an improvement and then make an improvement. Yeah. So in my business life, the thing, you know, and I believe everybody's got strengths and improvement opportunities. And the thing that I haven't yet mastered really in all areas of my life is how to deal with conflict in the best way. And you know, I've got better at it, but I wouldn't say I've got a level of mastery. And I still sort of, you know, back down sometimes from a conflict situation, where if I had real mastery, I'd handle it better.
Okay. Wished afterward that you hadn't backed down.
And it's you know, asked me a question about mistakes in my life. Sometimes there's a great scene in the movie Scent of a Woman. I don't know if anybody's seen it. It's quite an old movie. And the sort of
Al Pacino,
the Al Pacino character says, you know, every crossroads I came to in my life, I knew what the right path was, and I didn't take it. And you know, there's a bit of that in me as well. Sometimes you kind of know what the right thing to do is, and for organizational pressures or whatever, you know. So that's the thing I would like to get mastery on. And in my private life, it's golf. I play golf, and it's another thing that's sort of subject to mastery, because I think you never can master it, but I enjoy playing.
And so now we've talked about your weaknesses. What's your greatest accomplishment?
The greatest accomplishment? I thought about this as well. And I think I can pick several, you know, I can pick business events and several things. And I think, looking back, the thing I'm most pleased about is when I add together all the bits of my life. When you add it all up, it's sort of it's something that I feel pretty good about. So if I look at my career, I've got a job that when I started the firm, I had no sense I could kind of get as sort of to the position that I got in the firm. And you know, I'm seen inside BP as, you know, and I get upward feedback, and Roland can confirm this, but I'm a respected leader, and people would say I do a good job at coaching and mentoring people, which I feel really good about. So I like that. I've been married for 33 years to the same person who's my best friend, and I feel pretty good about that. We've got 2 great kids who are in their 20s, and we all still get along, which is a pretty major accomplishment in my mind. I've run a sub-3-hour marathon, and I'm still in pretty good shape for a 55-year-old. So if you add all of that up, the sort of total package, I think, is a pretty good accomplishment.
Yeah, that's great.
And I think it is important to sort of, you know, I say to folks, young managers in BP, you're listening, Roland, I mean, the company will take all the hours that you throw at it, actually. And it is important, you know, whether you're cycling from Austin to Alaska, it is important to find other things in your life outside of work, because it adds a richness to it and it gives you a vitality when you're at work. Yeah. So I think it is important to, you know, no matter how you do it, to get sort of some balance in your life. Plus, it makes you kind of a more interesting person.
Yeah, but how do you manage the work-life balance? Because, like you say, it'll take all the time you'll give it, and there's a lot of tangible reward to that.
I think you've got to be, you know, you've got to be sort of thoughtful about it, and make, you know, commitments and honor the commitments. You know, and there are times when, you know, I've made a commitment to be at, you know, the kids' school play, that, you know, and I walk out of a business and I say, look, you know, that's what I'm going to go and do. And sometimes you've got to make tough decisions and stand by them. But my own experience is that you know, it is ultimately important to do that. It's kind of your life, and you should sort of live it the way you want to live it.
Yeah. Well, you don't stay married 33 years if you don't make some of the right choices.
I don't know. And, you know, that's been, you know, and we've had sort of moments. I think the other thing is, this is true, it's important to stay in communication, both at work and in life.
Yes.
And, you know, sort of being open about, you know, my wife will say to me, I'm really pissed off because you've been doing this. And, you know, and it's sort of, you know, it's actually good to communicate.
Yeah, that's right. Well, let's talk a little about the company.
Yep.
So first off, I think a good thing, you're the head of this E&P area, so if maybe you could give us some context for that and tell us how that fits into BP.
Yeah, well, there are two parts to BP, really. And it's pretty simple. There's an upstream part and a downstream part. And the upstream part is the part that I'm in that sort of explores for, discovers, and produces oil and gas. Right. So we're the sort of, you know, the engineering. And then there's a piece that does, it's called the downstream, being at the model. They do the refining and the marketing. So they've got the big refineries, Texas City, and then they've got the service stations. Right. So those are the kind of two parts of it. And I've been in the upstream pretty much most of the 30 years, and I think it's a great business. It produces heat, light, energy, and you know, it's an interesting thing about the world, right? If you're in a cold place, you want it to be hot, and if you're in a hot place, you want it to be cold, and people do need to move around. So I think at some level that the firm does actually meet a basic set of human needs, and it does so in, you know, we should talk about Macondo, but it does so in what I believe is a responsible way to a broad set of stakeholders.
And I'm told the B used to stand for British, but now it stands for Beyond.
Beyond,
is that right?
No, I think it stands for BP. It doesn't stand for...
Doesn't stand for anything anymore. Okay.
I think, well, British Petroleum, several people have called it British Petroleum, which is what it used to be. Beyond Petroleum was an idea, which was, you know, we needed to think about, broader societal trends, and not just about the oil and gas industry. Nice. And I think now it's just plain BP.
Okay, good. So in your time as CFO, what have you seen BP do to try to distinguish itself from its competitors?
Well, it's tough. I mean, I think it's interesting because all of the super majors do pretty much the same thing. So at one level, you could say we're pretty similar. I think the thing that distinguishes us is ultimately our culture and our values. And I think all of the majors have got a sort of almost a different identity in terms of their culture and their values. And I think that the thing that maybe distinguishes us is the value that we place on constructive relationships of all types, whether it's with host governments in the world, our partners, our suppliers, and the communities. And I think it is interesting because obviously the events of 2010 in the Gulf of Mexico and Macondo were a tragic accident, and you know, everybody would wish it didn't happen. The thing that's interesting, though, is that the response to the accident did actually, in a deep way, reveal the values of the company. And it's you know, you can get a view by watching Anderson Cooper 360, or you can get a view by talking to the communities in the Gulf of Mexico on the coast. And the communities say that, you know, by and large, we were real people trying to do the right thing, and we put a lot of financial and human effort into making good the problems that we created. And I think it is in times like that where you sort of reveal the culture and the values of the company. And the fact that, you know, people want to work for us and they've got a certain sense of pride in how we responded is pretty important. And of course, it was, you know, it was a real tragedy, and you know, we've got to work as hard as we can to prevent anything like that ever happening again.
Has the company changed as a result of it?
Dramatically. I mean, it's been a dramatic shift, and it's interesting because, you know, people have written books saying failure to learn, and you can draw a line from the Texas City incident that happened in 2005. And Macondo, and I think we realized that we needed to have a really big change. So, you know, a lot of the senior executives left the company. We restructured. We've created an independent safety and operational risk group. We've put safety and operational risk at the heart of the company, and we're working really hard to change the culture of the company to honor the fact that it's a high hazard industry and we need to sort of behave and treat it that way.
Okay.
And we're doing, things inside the firm, and the way that we're operating in the Gulf of Mexico now is beyond the regulatory requirements. We believe we need, 2 blind shear rams where the industry only requires us to have 1. It's putting us at a competitive disadvantage, but we believe it's the right thing to do.
What do you think a company's role is in corporate social responsibility generally?
Well, that's a good question. So there's 2. You can go to there's the Milton Friedman end, which basically says, all the company's got to do is raise cash flow for the shareholders. Yep. And it's interesting because Michael Porter now is saying, actually, if you actually do this right, it can be strategic. It can create strategic advantage if you think about all dimensions of corporate responsibility, social responsibility. And I'm more on the sort of Michael Porter end. And I think firms do have, they obviously got an accountability to their shareholders, but they've got an accountability to a broader set of stakeholders. And it's something we've always believed in. I'll give you sort of the 2 examples that stand by. When I was in Alaska, it was interesting because we worked with a local Eskimo community. I remember speaking to one of the local leaders who said, Mr. Armstrong, I was the sort of manager of the oil field, and he said, in my mind, the best form of a social program is a job. And we employed a lot of Eskimos and made a big impact on the local community because it gave them work. And the money was important, but there are big sort of problems with alcohol addiction. And he said, the best thing is actually for the young folks to have a meaningful job, which we provided. And the other great example is when I was I had accountability for the Caribbean and Latin America. If ever you get the Caribbean in your job title, it's a clue to stay there as long as you can. But we had a business in Trinidad, and the history in Trinidad, I had an oil business, and they were building a gas business. And what they'd done with the oil business, all of the infrastructure had been built in the Gulf Coast and shipped over. And at the time, we were in a big discussion with Trinidad about sort of the fiscal terms of the gas business. And one of our Trinidadian guys had this idea that instead of building the infrastructure in Houston, we could create a construction yard it was in a place called Point La Brea in Trinidad, and build the platforms in Trinidad and create jobs for the young Trinis, which is what we did. It's been going now for 7 years. It's created a lot of skilled labor. Each one's got kind of better, and it transformed the conversation that we're having with the government about the sort of fiscal terms and conditions. So I actually believe you can be. There's an enlightened view here, which is it's not window dressing. It's not a burden. It's actually something that if you get it right could be strategic and create business value.
So have you run into situations where you've had to deal with problems relating to the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and things like this? You've worked all over the world. So
no, we're very clear. I mean, we're very clear that we don't, we're a big subscriber to, in Europe, it's called EITI, which is the Extraction Industries Transparency Initiative. And in the US, it's called Dodd-Frank, where the legislation is around companies publishing down to a project level the sort of revenue and how the kind of money flows in the countries that we operate. And we are very strong on this. And you get put in difficult situations in places like Venezuela. When I was originally when I went, and it starts with small stuff. It starts with small stuff like, you pay a government official a bribe to skip the line in customs when you're, coming getting off a plane. And you stop and think about it, you think, but then where does it stop?
Yeah.
And you've got to be very rigorous about this stuff because you can't afford. Ultimately, the economic argument is it's economically inefficient, right?
Yeah.
Which is right. But it's just unfair on societies. So I
it's
think
those crossroads you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, you've got to do the right thing. It isn't always easy.
Yeah.
But I think what the thing to do, if you're in a position like that, there are industry bodies where, when I was it was the Venezuela American Chamber of Commerce. You needn't go it alone. As an industry group, you can kind of get together and say, look, guys, this is where we stand on this issue. And if you kind of join up, it's a lot easier than sort of doing it solo.
Good. So as you're managing people, you've talked a little bit about that. What do you look for in those that you evaluate? You've talked about the characteristics to advance in a career. I would assume there'd be some similarity, but on a more detailed level.
Yeah, well, I think it's a good question because I think what I'd say is there's something around people people delivering, good work. So there is something that the work product is important. I think people's attitude is important. So it's like, work product, positive attitude. And the thing that we watch for, and that I watch for, is actually how well they get on with their peers. And there's always this tension between people who want to stand out to the expense of their peers. And those are people who end up ultimately, they might have a sort of a fast start on their career, but in the end their peers don't like them. And they eventually don't get on. So I think there's a fine line between, wanting to stand out to advance yourself through the quality of your work and your attitude, but I think it's hugely important in doing that not to alienate your peer group.
But at the same time, you still have to not hide your light, right? No,
absolutely not. It's back to the advice that my friend Bernard Coker gave me. You've got to do a good job. You've got to do a good job. You've got to sort of, stand up and say, here's kind of what I've done. You've got to have a positive attitude. But there are some people who are so ambitious. They're like a bit of firework. They kind of have, 3 years. These guys are really standing out. Their peers don't kind of like them, and then ultimately they crash and burn. So I think you do need to be able to work in teams. And I think a core test is, what your peers would say about you.
Okay. Let me ask you one last question before we open it up here, which is, I know about turtles because I have a cousin who worked for BP, and so I thought it's an interesting management development technique. I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about being a turtle.
Yeah, well, this is a term which the meaning of it, the perceived meaning of it in BP now is we have this role which is like an executive assistant to a senior manager, and I had 18 months working as John Brown's executive assistant as a turtle, which is an amazing development. You're sort of basically a bag carrier, and you take notes in meetings. But what was amazing is that I got into all of the meetings that John was having with oil ministers and government ministers and senior members of Exxon and Mobil. I kind of got into the room and saw how the process worked, which you can't buy that sort of experience.
That's right.
And then 10 years later, when I was business unit leader in Venezuela, I was the guy in the oil minister's office, but I kind of been there and knew what it was like. So amazing learning experience. The name Turtle came from a guy. There's 4 of us originally, 4 of us, which gives you a bit of a clue. And at the time, a guy called David Peaty's son Lewis was a big fan of the Teenage Ninja Mutant Turtles. And we all had a nickname. I can't remember which one I was now. I think I was Leonardo and he was Raphael. And it stuck because you needed a hard shell to kind of withstand the sort of, the boss's angst when you didn't get things right. So that was the history.
That's great. So you take your learning wherever you can find it, I guess, even if it means carrying a bag sometimes, huh?
Absolutely.
That's good. Well, let me open it to you now, give you a chance to ask some questions. I see we have a couple of microphones in the aisles, so if you have a question, please line up and we'll call on you in that order. One is starting us off. Go ahead.
Hi, Mr. Armstrong. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Luke Fernandez. My question for you is, what is BP's role and other big energies roles in the whole renewable energy movement, and kind of where do you guys see yourself as a player in that movement?
Okay, great. Well, I think it's an important part of our portfolio, and it's in the context of the total energy mix. So if you look at the, most projections for energy, the energy mix going out 40, 50 years, which is in a reasonable time frame, are actually quite interesting. They say that, the world is still going to rely to a large extent on hydrocarbons, oil and gas, which we're present in a large part of our business. Renewables is relatively small, but fast growing. Nuclear is going to grow a little bit. And what's interesting is coal is set to sort of grow pretty much in line with other hydrocarbon fuels. And you can have a sort of view on that. In terms of renewables, we're focusing on wind. We've got a large wind business in the US. And then in the downstream, we're focusing on biofuels. We were just discussing this earlier in the break. And the big area of our interest is on biofuels that don't compete with food crops. So you can, ethanol's a problem because you can use it as a food crop. Corn you can use as a fruit crop. There's research into cellulosic biofuels where you use the cellulosic structure of the plant, which is non-edible. And I think that's kind of the interesting environment. So it's an important part of our business. We've got an alternative energy business. It's relatively small in terms of our market capitalization. We're investing, I think, $1 billion over 5 years into that business. But I think it reflects the reality of the energy mix and the base business that we've got.
Thank you.
Would you be able to talk about a foreign political challenge you guys have had in other countries and what you've had to do to correct it?
Sorry, could you just repeat the question? The foreign political challenge?
Yeah, foreign political challenges you've had dealing with other countries and their policies, and what you've had to do to correct it or to fix the problem.
Sorry, I missed the last part of the question.
What did you have to do to fix the problem?
What do I have to do to fix the problem? Okay, great. Well, some of them we haven't got a good answer for at the moment. So we've obviously got ongoing issues in the U.S. We're in a series of legal cases that I can't talk about. So we've got political challenges here in the U.S. If you read the newspapers, you'll see that we've got challenges with our partners in Russia. And we tried to sell some assets in Argentina and had problems with the assets in Argentina. I think that the reality is that we operate in many countries, and the oil and gas industry in many places is a major source of the economy. So it's highly politicized in lots of places that we operate. And I think our experience is that ultimately, we are a servant to the host government, so we want to actually, use our technical and project management expertise to generate revenues from the oil and gas, and do that in a regulatory framework that stays in place. But from time to time, the political world changes, and they want to sort of renegotiate contracts, and we try and do that in a way that's constructive, and we aren't always successful. Our history in Russia, we've been in Russia now for 20 years, and it's taken twists and turns. And despite what you read in the newspaper, the business itself has been incredibly successful. We invested $7 billion in the joint venture. We've got out something like $35 billion, and we've got a 50% share of a business that's got a market capitalization of $60 billion. So it's like an amazing investment, and it's been politically difficult. Right now, we're in Egypt. Egypt's going through a period of huge instability at the moment. One of the problems we had was that the Egyptian government couldn't pay us what we were due for the oil that we were producing, and we came up with a really constructive, the finance team in Egypt did a brilliant job coming up with a constructive way to restructure the payment schedule that basically gave the Egyptian government credit until the IMF and the World Bank came through with a new batch of loans for them. So we in effect were able to act as banker to the Egyptian. But we've been in Egypt for 60 years. We've had a presence. We've seen governments come and governments go. And it's part of the risk profile of the business. So I think the way that we deal with it is by trying to engage constructively with the governments where we operate. It's interesting, in Venezuela, Chavez came to power and changed the terms of the agreements. One of our competitors basically exited the country and sued. And I think they got a payment, ultimately it was like 10 cents on the dollar. We stayed and tried to work inside of the new framework. And eventually we sold our assets to T&K BP, but it was like 60 cents on the dollar. So it was just an example of actually, staying there and, being constructive and trying to find a solution. But it's not, it's one of the great things and one of the difficult things about our business. It's not always easy. It's not easy in Nigeria for Shell at the moment. Fortunately, we don't have a position in Nigeria. But again, if you look at the GDP of many countries, 3/4 to 60% of it's the oil and gas industry, the energy industry. So it's highly politicized.
Thank you.
Great question.
Hi, my name is Sunny Das, and I'm a second-year finance major here. And first of all, I just want to thank you for your time today. And my question kind of stems from the Field of Future initiative that's been put in place in BP right now. I'm just wondering, with that initiative, how it's going to impact the industry as a whole, and whether your competitors have taken a similar route implementing a strategy with that.
Was this field of the future?
Yes.
Okay, this is a technology question. It's great. So because of my background, I used to be responsible for the Field of the Future program. And I mean, this is, in BP, we have a series of technology programs called flagships. And they're all big programs that can make a material impact on our business. And Field of the Future is one of those programs. And the basic idea is we're going to use, all of the technologies that we can to maximize recovery and productivity from the oil fields that we operate. I don't think it's necessarily a proprietary idea, and I think all of our competitors are trying to do the same thing. But it is a big deal for the world's oil and gas reserves. I don't know if you're not in a sort of geosciences, the typical recovery factor when the oil and gas industry began for oil fields was less than 20%. So less than 20% of the oil that's down there is recovered. Through use of technology, it's now sort of 50%, sometimes 60%. And Field of the Future is a range of technologies that are associated with improving recovery from today's oil and gas fields. And it's one of the things that we can offer to host governments. For example, we've just got access in Iraq, which is another interesting place to operate, to improve the recovery of Rumaila, which is one of the world's giant oil and gas fields. And it's basically using a combination of seismic technology to get a better image of the subsurface, optimizing. We use design of water now. In the past, you used to just inject plain water. You can now actually change the geochemistry of the water to influence the properties of how the oil bonds to the rock to recover more of the oil. So there's a whole range of technologies that can improve the recovery factor. And if you think about the world's energy, a 5% improvement, 10%, 20% improvement in the oil that's already been discovered is kind of huge in terms of energy sufficiency for the world.
All right, thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hi, Mr. Armstrong. My name is Jay. I believe we spoke earlier. My question for you is, looking back on your college career, what's one piece of advice you could give us when making, a decision to choose whatever job we pursue, declare our major? If you could tell yourself one thing in college, what would it be?
Sorry, I'm just the microphone is.
They're a little bit hard, yes.
Yeah. What was if I could one?
If you could tell yourself one thing in college, what would it be?
One thing in college. Yeah, right. I'd say two things. The first thing is, when I was in college, I did civil engineering, and I worked for a while for a civil engineering company. And I didn't really know how my life and career was going to turn out. So the thing I had told myself in college is, don't get too stressed about making the right choice. Because some people know all their life they want to do this certain thing. And at least in my life, I didn't know. So the thing I would have told myself is to give yourself the most options and pick one that you're going to like doing and gives you the most options. And as I look back as my career unfolded, I wasn't aware at the I made big decisions about where I was going to live, where I was going to work. Some of them I thought they were big decisions at the time and they weren't. Some of them looking back really were big decisions because they sort of changed my life and I didn't know it at the time. So it's tough to call, but I think the other thing is, at times in your life and career, you will get opportunities, and you've got to sort of, take them when they present themselves. Because, you often get, I know I got the opportunity to work for John Brown as a turtle, and this was like a big decision, because everybody said it's going to be 18 months of sheer hell. And I had young kids, and I thought, do I really want to do this? Yeah. And we made a family decision and said, yeah, let's kind of go for it. And out of that, at the end of that, I got an assignment to Alaska, which was, one of our life-changing experiences, living in Alaska for 4 years. Mm-hmm. Now, who's to say, if I had chosen a different path, my life would have worked out great, but it would have just been different. So it's, I think what I'd say is, don't get too hung up on making the absolute right choice, but make a choice that leads to options rather than closes options down.
Thank you.
And then the other thing I'd say, you didn't ask me the question, what was the worst thing I did in my career? And it was one of these decisions when I knew what the right decision was, and I didn't have the courage to make the right decision. I chose a decision that was going to allow me to meet my short-term objectives and my annual bonus, and it was ultimately a bad long-term decision, and I should have had the courage to make the right decision at the time, and I didn't. So I think, you sometimes you need to listen to this voice in the back of your head that's telling you what the right thing to do is, and listen to it hard, because it's sometimes right.
Often right.
Yeah, that was in the matter of English understatement. It's always right.
Always.
Thank you.
Yes, over here.
Hi, Mr. Armstrong. My name's Angela. And in Texas, we have lots of opportunities to work in the energy industry. So I was just wondering what your favorite part about working in the industry is.
It's just the variety. I mean, I think it's a great industry to work in. I think this is my plug now. I think BP is a great company to work for. We're doing our recruiting next week. Come and sign up. If you don't do that, a lot of people have said they've interned with other energy companies, Chevron. They're all great companies, and it's a great industry to be in. Just because of it's important, it's relevant to the world, and it's got amazing technology, it's got amazing sort of commercial negotiations, and it's just got a huge variety. And BP's been around for 100 years, and I know that it will be around for another 100 years. So it's got kind of longevity as well.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Armstrong. My name is Spencer Davis. I wanted to thank you again for coming out today. My question for you is based off of, you've talked a lot about going abroad and working abroad. Can you talk about the operations and maybe the pros and cons of it?
Yeah, I think operational roles are great. The thing, I liked it for its own sake. I spent 3 years working offshore in the North Sea, and then I spent 3 years working with an operational role on the North Slope of Alaska. And it's one of those things that gives you great experience at leading teams who don't put up with any bullshit, because these are kind of old experienced folks, and they kind of tell you the way it is. And actually, learning to lead and manage in that environment was just a great developmental experience for me. And it's one that I wouldn't have got so early in my life just working in an office environment. In an office environment, I was leading a team of maybe 5 people, which is totally different from leading a team of 100 employees, probably 100 contractors in an industrial setting. So I just think those type of roles are great learning and development experiences. And if you get the opportunity to do one, I would sort of say sign up for it, because you learn a lot.
Thank you.
Over here.
Hi, my name's Lauren. I'm a marketing major here at UT. And I have a question for you. So you travel around a lot, obviously, and you focus a lot on your family life as well. So what do you think were the difficulties in having to relocate a lot and dealing with family and how to balance that?
It's a great question, because it's, again, we were talking about this, because sometimes it was great, and my kids really liked it, and sometimes it was difficult, and we were away from England for 9 years, and when we moved back, my daughter fit in really easily, and my son found it really difficult, because he didn't know any of the popular culture. He didn't know any of the sports teams, the kind of pop music or anything like that. It was a time when Facebook didn't exist, and he was like, not wired to the internet, and he found it difficult to readjust. Now, he says it was a great experience. They both learned to speak Spanish and lived in different cultures. So I think it is possible. I do think that there are sort of critical times in your life where you do need to be in one place for a certain length of time. And there were times when both of our kids were taking big exams in their school life, and we were pretty clear that we needed to be in a particular place in time for 3 years to provide them with that sort of continuity. So I think you need to think about it thoughtfully and make sort of decisions that work for you as a family. But it can be hugely rewarding in terms of living and experiencing different cultures. And you've got to acknowledge that there can also be difficulties. One of the things I think with late teens, if you move around a lot, is at the time when people start forming relationships, you can get a dynamic where, because people are going to move every 18 months, they don't invest in making relationships, because they're going to kind of, they're not going to be sustained over time. Right. And there are case studies of people who, in adult life, find it difficult to make relationships because they moved around too much as a child. So I think it's hugely rewarding, and you need to be thoughtful about it.
Thank you.
Hello, Mr. Armstrong. My name is Juan Higuera, and my question was in relationship to the price differential in North America between oil and natural gas. I was wondering, what is BP's view of the current situation? Is it a good entry point to buy natural gas reserves, or is BP going to go after more oily assets?
Well, the price of gas is a big surprise to many people in the industry. I was just saying before that, we bought gas assets when the gas price was $10. If you saw our, today it's like between 2 and 3. We wrote down some of the book value of some of our assets in our second quarter results by, I think it was $1 billion. BHP did the same thing. Interesting enough, the US majors who follow US GAAP didn't need to do it. It's because we use the IFRS. We've got a different accounting policy treatment. So we had to write down the assets and others didn't, just because of the way they do the discounted cash flow analysis.
That's interesting, yeah.
I think in the long run, I think gas prices have got to kind of come up because it's a clean fuel and the world's going to need gas. I think in the short term, there's a lot of gas around in the world, and you combine an abundance of gas with slow economic growth, and I think gas prices are likely to remain sort of low for some time. So strategically, we're biasing our investment towards wet gas, just because it's actually more profitable at the moment. The thing that we're really interested, though, is holding on to the high-quality dry assets that we've got at low cost, because we believe in the medium term the gas price will come up just because the world's going to need a clean source of energy, which gas is a lot cleaner than coal.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think we have time just for the 2 questions who are standing, so why don't you start over here?
Hi, thank you for coming. I just had a question for you. As you developed through your career, what did you use, or how did you kind of continue your education, and what did you use to kind of guide you as you took on different leadership roles?
Well, it's a combination again of, I think, BP and big firms do classroom developmental training. So I had the great, when I was 40 years old, it's 15 years ago, it's my 15-year class reunion at Stanford next month. So I had the opportunity to go, sort of 15 years into my career for a year of educational experience, which was, an amazing opportunity. There are, though, sort of 1-month training programs you can do. We sent people to 3-month training programs at business schools to kind of fill in both technical and leadership skills. And again, you can get sort of structured training and even if the company doesn't provide structured training, there's nothing to stop you as a group of kind of peers, just kind of giving each other feedback about, how you are, you can do a project and then afterwards kind of, debrief how people behaved, what was effective, what wasn't effective. So I think if you're creative about it, there are lots of ways you can think about your ongoing learning and development. And again, I think formal education plays an important part, but you can do a lot sort of informally. And I think the important thing is to have a commitment to continue to learn.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And last question for you.
In terms of moving up on a more management level, is it better to move up on a regional level or more of a product service line level?
I think it depends on the organization, and I think one of the changes we've made inside of BP following Macondo was to shift to a more functional organization, which would be the equivalent to a product line organization, and away from a regional model. So I think it depends on the nature of the firm. I think what's important is if you actually look at the firm, you can kind of see which are the routes to the top. In some firms it may be product line, in some it may be kind of regional. And I think you've got to sort of, in some ways, talk to people, find a good mentor, and get some advice as to what are the appropriate career moves that are going to give you the best development set of options. So I think it's hard to give a specific. I think the important thing is to find a good mentor, and I go back to you've got to do good work. You've got to have good behavioral skills, and you've got to get on well with your peers.
Great. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That was very interesting. In the words of your mentor, you did a good job. Thank you.
Thanks very much, guys.
Thank you very much, Dean Platt and Mr. Armstrong. Thank you so much for coming tonight. I know that we will be able to take your lessons and apply them to our own lives and careers. As a token of appreciation, the Undergraduate Business Council would like to present Mr. Armstrong with this personalized Stetson cowboy hat in recognition of your participation in the VIP Distinguished Speaker Series.
Put it on, do a little hookup. Can we get a hookup?